Carol Jennings sold the only home she had ever owned outright to save her son's business, on a handshake and a promise with nothing written down at all. 18 months later, sitting alone in a rented apartment she could barely afford, she finally asked him the one question she had been too afraid to ask from the very beginning. This is her story. Carol was 68 years old, divorced for 18 years, a retired nurse who had spent 34 years working the floor of the same regional hospital in a small Missouri town. She had raised her only son, Brian, largely on her own after her divorce, in a modest 3-bedroom house she'd managed to pay off completely by the time she turned 60. That house represented, in the most literal and important sense, the entire financial foundation of Carol's retirement, paid in full, free of any mortgage, worth more as a source of security than as a number on paper. Carol had worked long, demanding shifts throughout Brian's childhood, often picking up overtime whenever it was offered, determined to give her son a stable home, despite raising him largely alone. She remembered vividly the particular pride she felt the day she made the final mortgage payment on that house, sitting at her kitchen table with the paid-off deed in front of her, understanding in a way that felt almost physical that no matter what else happened in her life, from that point forward, she would always have a roof that belonged entirely to her. That feeling of unshakable security had quietly anchored the last 8 years of her retirement, the one certainty she never imagined she would ever willingly give up. Brian, 43, owned a small auto repair shop he'd built from nothing over the past 12 years. The kind of business that had, for most of that time, provided a modest but steady living for himself, his wife Denise, and their 2 teenage children. But a series of difficult years, a slow economy, a costly equipment failure, a couple of large jobs that fell through unexpectedly, had left the shop deeply behind on payments to its suppliers, close enough to closing that Brian genuinely believed and told his mother that without a significant infusion of cash within a matter of weeks, he would lose the business entirely. Carol received that phone call on an ordinary Tuesday evening and heard, underneath her son's carefully composed explanation, a raw, more frightened tone she hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. "Mom, I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. I just need enough to catch up with the suppliers and buy us some breathing room. Once things stabilize, I'll pay you back completely, I promise." The amount Brian needed was significant, more than Carol had sitting in savings, more than she could reasonably borrow against her modest pension without creating serious strain. There was really only one asset, substantial enough to solve the problem quickly. Carol's older sister, Nancy, 71, was the first person Carol called after hanging up with Brian, and the first voice of real caution Carol heard that entire evening. "Carol, please, before you do anything, at least talk to a lawyer first," Nancy said. "I lived through something like this with my own husband's family, decades ago. It never goes the way anyone hopes it will, even with the best intentions on both sides." Carol heard her sister's warning and understood, on some level, that it was probably wise advice. But the image in her mind of her son losing everything he'd built, of her grandchildren watching their father's business collapse, of Brian's carefully controlled voice on that phone call, crowded out the caution almost entirely. "Nancy, it's Brian. He's not going to just disappear on me. He's my son." Carol listed her house within the week, moving faster than she'd ever moved on any major decision in her adult life, driven by the urgency Brian had described and her own desire to help him quickly, cleanly, without complication. The house sold within a month for a fair price, and Carol transferred the vast majority of the proceeds directly to Brian shortly after closing, an amount large enough to fully satisfy his supplier debts and give the shop genuine breathing room. There was no contract, no promissory note, no interest rate, no specific repayment schedule, nothing beyond Brian's sincere verbal promise that he would pay her back once the business stabilized. Carol didn't ask for anything more formal, and it genuinely didn't occur to her in the moment that she should. This was her son. Formal paperwork felt to her almost insulting to suggest between the two of them. With the remaining portion of the sale, Carol rented a small, comfortable apartment near the center of town, close to her favorite grocery store, and an easy walk from the library where she'd recently started volunteering twice a week. She told herself, moving into that apartment, that this represented a genuine fresh start. Smaller, simpler, closer to town, exactly the kind of downsizing she might have chosen eventually anyway, just accelerated a bit sooner than planned. For the first several months, everything proceeded roughly as Brian had promised. The shop stabilized, the supplier debts cleared, and Brian made 2 modest payments toward what he owed his mother, each one accompanied by a grateful, reassuring phone call. Carol felt, during those early months, a quiet vindication in her decision, a sense that her instinct to trust her son completely had been the right one after all. The first sign of trouble arrived quietly, the way these things usually do. The third payment, due at the start of a new month, simply didn't arrive. When Carol mentioned it gently during their regular Sunday call, Brian apologized immediately, explaining that a large customer invoice had come in late that month, throwing off his own cash flow temporarily. He promised to catch up the following month with an additional amount added to make up the difference. Carol accepted the explanation easily. Businesses had slow months. She understood that better than most, having watched Brian navigate the ordinary unpredictability of running a small shop for over a decade. But the following month's payment arrived smaller than promised, with another reasonable-sounding explanation attached, and the month after that, no payment came at all, followed by an apologetic text message rather than a phone call promising to sort it out soon. Around the same time, Carol began noticing something about her own new budget that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The rent on her apartment, reasonable as it had seemed when she signed the lease, was consuming a considerably larger share of her monthly pension than she had originally planned for, a gap she had expected Brian's steady repayments to help close, a gap that, without those payments arriving reliably, simply widened month by month. She found herself, for the first time in years, quietly delaying a routine dental appointment, telling herself it could easily wait another few months. She stopped buying the good coffee she'd always enjoyed, switching to a cheaper brand without really admitting to herself why. Small adjustments, individually unremarkable, that she never would have needed to make in the house she'd owned outright for years. She thought more than once during those months about her decades on the hospital floor, about the countless patients she'd cared for who had quietly sacrificed their own basic needs to help an adult child, only to end up in her emergency room months or years later, their own health having deteriorated in ways that might have been prevented with earlier, proper care. She had counseled families about exactly this pattern professionally, gently encouraging patients to prioritize their own well-being even when family obligations pulled hard in the other direction. She had never imagined finding herself in her own retirement quietly practicing the very habit she'd spent a career warning others against. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, Brian and Denise pulled into Carol's apartment complex parking lot in a brand-new SUV, proudly showing off the purchase to Carol and the grandchildren, explaining that their old car had finally given out, and this had felt like the right time for an upgrade. Carol stood in that parking lot, admiring the vehicle the way a grandmother is expected to, while doing an uncomfortable, involuntary calculation in her head. The monthly payment on that new vehicle, set beside the money still owed to her, money that had for the past several months simply stopped arriving at all. She said nothing that day. She told herself it wasn't her place to comment on how her son and daughter-in-law managed their own household finances, even as a small, persistent unease settled somewhere in her chest that she couldn't quite shake for the rest of that visit. Denise, for her part, had felt uneasy about the entire arrangement from the very beginning, though she had never voiced that discomfort clearly to either Carol or Brian. She had watched quietly as the informal loan slowly transformed from an urgent rescue into something closer to an unspoken, indefinitely postponed obligation, and she carried a low-grade guilt about her own silence throughout most of that year, never quite finding the right moment or the right courage to raise it directly with her husband. She remembered in particular the evening Brian first told her about his mother's offer to sell the house, how relieved and grateful he had sounded, and how she had swallowed her own immediate unease in the face of that relief, not wanting to be the person standing between her husband and the rescue of everything he'd built. Looking back, she wished she had said something that very first night, not to stop Carol from helping, necessarily, but simply to insist that whatever agreement they reached be put in writing clearly before a single dollar changed hands. She hadn't said it, and as the months wore on and the payments grew increasingly irregular, that unspoken regret sat with her more heavily than she ever let on to either of them. 18 months after the sale of the house, Carol finally sat down with the numbers in a way she had been quietly avoiding for months, and understood with the same clear-eyed precision she'd once brought to reading a patient's chart exactly how far the gap between what was promised and what had actually arrived had grown. Brian had repaid in total less than a fifth of what Carol had given him. She called him that evening, her voice steadier than she felt, and asked a question she had never once asked directly in 18 months of gentle, patient waiting. "Brian, I need you to be honest with me. What is the actual plan for paying the rest of this back?" There was a long silence on the line, longer than Carol had ever heard from her son during any of their previous conversations about money. "Mom," he finally said, his voice thick with something that sounded like shame. "Honestly, I don't know. I wanted to pay you back so badly when I asked. I really believed I would be able to. But the shop is barely breaking even most months, and I just haven't been able to get ahead enough to actually catch up on what I owe you on top of everything else." "Did you know that back when you asked me?" Carol asked quietly. "Did you know there was a real chance you might not be able to pay it back?" Another long pause. "I don't know, Mom. I think some part of me knew it was a real risk. I just didn't want to say that out loud to you when you were the one person willing to actually help me in that moment. I didn't want to disappoint you on top of everything else that was falling apart." Carol hung up the phone that evening and sat alone in her small living room for a long time, feeling something settle over her that was heavier than simple disappointment. It wasn't that Brian had deliberately deceived her, not in any calculated way. It was something quieter and, in its own way, sadder, a kind of financial cowardice, an inability to say a difficult truth out loud at the exact moment it needed to be said, allowed to grow silently for 18 months until it had cost his mother far more than either of them had ever intended. She thought about all the moments over those 18 months when Brian could have told her the truth. The missed third payment, the shrinking fourth, the silent fifth, and how each time he had chosen a small, reassuring explanation instead, not out of malice, but out of the particular, familiar fear of watching disappointment cross his mother's face. She understood that fear better than she wanted to admit. She had spent much of her own life avoiding difficult conversations for similar reasons. But understanding where the silence came from didn't make the 18 months of consequences any easier to sit with now that they had finally fully arrived. The final blow arrived 2 weeks later in the form of a lease renewal notice from her apartment complex, informing her that her rent would be increasing by an amount that, combined with everything else, she genuinely could not comfortably absorb on her pension alone, not without the repayments she had been counting on and hadn't reliably received in months. Carol sat at her small kitchen table that evening with the notice in front of her and allowed herself, for the first time since selling the house, to fully feel the complete weight of what she had actually given up. Not simply a house, not simply a sum of money. The entire quiet, hard-won security she had spent 40 years of nursing shifts building, one paycheck at a time, handed over on the strength of a promise that had never been anything more than words. She called Nancy that night and cried for the first time through the entire ordeal, admitting everything she'd been quietly managing alone for months. "I should have listened to you," Carol said. "I should have at least talked to a lawyer, like you said." "You were trying to save your son's life's work," Nancy said gently. "That's not foolishness, Carol. That's love without enough protection built around it. There's a difference, and it's not too late to add some protection now, even this late in the process." The following week, Carol did what she probably should have done 18 months earlier. She met with an attorney Nancy recommended, someone with real experience in family financial matters, and described the entire situation from the beginning: the phone call, the house sale, the verbal promise, the 18 months of inconsistent, dwindling payments. The attorney was honest with her, without being unkind. What was done. The house was sold, the money was transferred, and pursuing any kind of aggressive legal action against her own son was neither realistic nor something Carol actually wanted. But there were still meaningful steps available to her, even this far into the situation. The attorney explained something that stayed with Carol long after that first meeting, that informal family loans like hers were remarkably common and remarkably rarely repaid in full, precisely because the absence of structure allowed the good intentions to quietly erode under the pressure of ordinary financial hardship, one reasonable excuse at a time. Formalizing the agreement now, even 18 months late, wouldn't undo what had already happened, but it would replace an open-ended, emotionally fraught expectation with something concrete that both Carol and Brian could actually plan around, rather than continuing to silently disappoint and resent each other indefinitely. The attorney helped Carol draft a simple, formal promissory note, retroactively documenting the original loan, establishing a specific realistic monthly repayment amount based on what Brian's business could actually sustain, with a clear timeline extending several years into the future. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wouldn't recover the money any faster than Brian's actual finances allowed, but it transformed a vague, unspoken disappointment into something concrete, documented, and mutually understood. A real agreement rather than a fading, increasingly resentful hope. Carol invited Brian to her apartment the following weekend, without Denise or the children present, for a conversation she prepared for carefully, the way she once prepared for a difficult conversation with a patient's family. "I'm not here to punish you," she told him, sliding the drafted agreement across her small kitchen table. "I love you, and I don't regret trying to help you save the business. But I do regret how we handled it, and I need us to fix that now, together, honestly." Brian read through the document quietly, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have been straight with you from the beginning, instead of just hoping things would somehow work themselves out." "I know," Carol said. I think honestly, we both avoided the hard conversation for different reasons. I avoided asking the difficult questions because I didn't want to seem like I didn't trust you. You avoided answering them honestly because you didn't want to disappoint me. Neither one of us did the other any favors by staying quiet. Brian signed the agreement that afternoon, committing to a modest but genuinely sustainable monthly payment, one that wouldn't threaten the shop's stability, but would slowly and reliably begin closing the gap between them. Carol also made a decision that surprised even herself in the weeks that followed. Rather than waiting anxiously for those slow, incremental payments to fully restore her financial footing, she began looking into part-time work at a nearby urgent care clinic, something she had always been mildly curious about during her working years, but had never needed to pursue. The extra income wasn't enormous, but it was hers, earned directly rather than dependent upon, and it gave her a sense of active control over her own situation that she hadn't felt in the entire 18 months since selling the house. She also made peace, slowly and without excessive self-blame, with the real possibility that she might never fully recover everything she had given up. Some of what she'd lost, not just money, but a certain unguarded trust, a certain ease in her relationship with her son, might simply need to be rebuilt differently going forward rather than fully restored to exactly what it once was. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this acceptance brought a quieter kind of relief than she expected. For months she had been silently waiting for a full restoration of the money, of the trust, of the version of her retirement she had originally planned before that Tuesday evening phone call changed everything. Letting go of that particular expectation and replacing it with a smaller, more honest picture of what her life could still look like going forward felt less like defeat and more like finally setting down something she had been carrying unnecessarily for far too long. The relationship between Carol and Brian in the months that followed grew into something more honest than it had been before, even if it never became entirely simple again. Brian called more often now, not just with updates on payments, but with genuine conversation, seemingly determined to rebuild something he understood. Finally, he had put at real risk. Denise, for her part, began speaking up more directly in family financial conversations, having learned her own quiet lesson about the cost of staying silent when something felt wrong from the very beginning. Carol noticed, too, a subtle shift in how Brian spoke about the shop itself, a new willingness to share the genuinely difficult months honestly, rather than smoothing them over with a reassuring tone meant to protect her from worry. When a slow month meant his payment to her would be a little late, he called ahead now, specifically, with an actual date rather than a vague promise, and more often than not, he kept his word. It wasn't the flawless arrangement either of them had originally imagined that first frightened phone call 18 months earlier, but it was real and reliable in a way the original handshake agreement had never quite managed to be. Carol's story is a common one, more common than most people realize, precisely because it rarely begins with anything resembling bad intentions on either side. A mother who loves her son, a son who genuinely believes, in a moment of real fear, that he'll be able to make things right. And in between the two of them, nothing written down at all to hold that good intention accountable to reality. It is worth noting that Carol's situation was never really about Brian being a bad son or Carol being a foolish mother. Both of them acted at every step from love, his desire to protect the business he'd spent 12 years building, hers to protect the son she'd raised largely alone. The danger in stories like this one rarely comes from malice. It comes from the simple human tendency to assume that love alone is sufficient protection, when in practice, love and structure need to work together, especially when the stakes involve the entire financial foundation of someone's later years. If you are ever considering selling a major asset to help a family member financially, put the agreement in writing before any money changes hands, no matter how uncomfortable that conversation feels in the moment. A written agreement is not a lack of trust. It is what allows trust to survive an unexpected setback. Understand that informal loans without a specific repayment schedule, interest terms, or timeline are rarely repaid in full, even among family members with the very best intentions. Structure protects everyone, including the person receiving the help. Before selling a significant asset like a home, To provide financial help, consult an attorney or financial planner about safer alternatives, a secured loan against the property, for instance, rather than an outright sale that eliminates your own financial safety net entirely. Recognize the real difference between helping someone you love and placing your own security at serious risk to do it. Genuine love does not require you to sacrifice the foundation of your own later years. And if you've already made an informal arrangement like this one, know that it's never too late to formalize it properly. An attorney can help transform a verbal promise into a real, documented commitment, protecting both sides and replacing quiet disappointment with clear, achievable expectations. Carol still lives in that same small apartment today, working 2 mornings a week at the urgent care clinic, receiving a modest, reliable payment from Brian on the first of every month, exactly as documented. It isn't the retirement she originally planned, but it is honest, it is stable, and slowly, month by month, it is becoming entirely her own again. Would you ever sell your home to help one of your children financially? What would you want in place first before agreeing to something like that? Tell us in the comments below and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else, considering exactly the decision Carol once made, might need to read your answer before they sign anything at all. If Carol's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with time for more stories from the Dignity years, because helping the people we love should never require signing away the safety we spent a lifetime building.